Well, welcome and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Harry Barton, and this is our closing session for this Sweet Natural Capital Green Recovery Conference. We've got a great lineup of speakers this afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome Luke Pollard, Plymouth MP and Shadow Defra Secretary. We've got talks from NatWest Bank and Triodos Bank. We've got talks, a number of presentations led by Ben Wheeler on health inequalities and green recovery post-COVID. And we'll have reflections as well on the whole conference from Ian Bateman. We'll be taking a break at about 2:20 and coming back, please, after 10 minutes sharp, because we've got a lot to get through at 22:03. And we'll wrap up at about 3:45. Now, before we start, just a couple of housekeeping things to say. The first is just to say this is a webinar session, so attendees, please have your video and audio turned off. And you'll be relieved to know that you can't do this by mistake. You can't turn them on by mistake. If you want to discuss any topic or contact the host for technical help, please use the chat function, which hopefully you can see on your screen. And if you have any questions for the speakers and panelists, and we will have Q&A after each of the speakers, please put these in the Q&A function, not the chat function, please, the Q&A function, which you should see next to it at the bottom of your screen. And when we have questions, you can upvote questions. Sounds slightly sinister, doesn't it? But you can upvote them. So if enough people vote for a question, it goes to the top of the list. So if you think that's a really good question and you really want the speaker to answer it, then that's what you do. You upvote that question. And to do this, click the thumbs up button next to the question. So it's my great pleasure to introduce now our first speaker, who is Luke Pollard, Plymouth MP, as I said, Shadow Defra Secretary. And I talk to a lot of MPs, I'm sure we all do, and not all of them get the natural capital concept. But I can assure everyone that Luke Pollard absolutely does get this concept. So we're very lucky to have him speak to us this afternoon. Luke.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. You've got a out-and-out Plymouth nationalist, someone who's incredibly proud of the Southwest, banging on about green stuff at you for the next 10 minutes or so. But I want this to be a moment to not only talk about what we can do better as a region, but also a moment for us to really be positive about the enormous opportunities that we have ahead and the fantastic amount of infrastructure, expertise and energy that we have in our region that is really doing some exceptionally special stuff at the moment. I'm, as well as being a Plymouth MP, I'm also Labour's Shadow Environment Secretary. So it's my job to talk about all things green on behalf of the Labour Party. And it's something that I do so really quite proudly, because as a country, we're facing some enormous challenges. And there's three in particular that set the context for why this type of work is so important. And these will be familiar to you, so I won't spend too long on it. The first one is the fact that the virus is producing a jobs crisis. And it's also fundamentally challenging us to reassess the foundations and the assumptions that we've made in terms of how we do business, how we travel, how we live, and perhaps most importantly, what's important to us. Now, you probably found yourself during lockdown recognizing that nature played a bigger part in your lives. If you're on this webinar anyway, I imagine you spend quite a lot of time with nature in the first place, but you probably found yourself and your friends and family saying things like, isn't it great to hear the birds sing more? Isn't it great to value time in the park or along a canal or by a river or along the coast? It was those fundamentals that we grew a greater connection with. The second, which I won't dwell on, is Brexit. Now, I can't tell you what the Brexit deal is going to look like, or if we're even going to have one in the next few weeks or so. But the uncertainty that creates is damaging, but also the uncertainty about our regulatory direction. In the past, it was quite clear where our regulations were going, especially around environmental protection. At the moment, I have some concerns about where we are going in terms of what a new environmental regulatory model will look like, what it will incentivize, what behaviors it will incentivize, whether the precautionary principle will still be central to our policy making, or whether we'll adopt a different risk-based approach more akin to the American model, which I'm not too keen on, to be honest. The final of those challenges that you know is the climate crisis. Now, the climate crisis is not just a crisis about carbon. When Parliament declared a climate emergency about a year and a half ago, it was not just about saying that we're in a carbon crisis, although we are. It was also setting out very clearly that we've got an ecological crisis at the same time. Within the Labour Party and within government, carbon and nature are separated. The Department for Business looks after carbon, obviously, and Defra, the Department for Energy, Food and Rural Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, looks after nature. Now, that's an English context because it's devolved in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. But that sometimes means that the approaches that are put in place to deal with carbon don't always link up seamlessly to deal with nature, to deal with biodiversity, to deal with protection of vulnerable habitats, to deal with really maximizing the opportunity that a greener economy presents. And I think that creates a bit of a problem. You've probably seen ministers standing in front of banners that say "Build Back Better." Now, politics at the moment is quite fond of three-word sound bites. It's a great way of communicating complex messages very simply, but it also risks dumbing down quite a lot of that importance and focus on detail to be vague generalizations. I want us to build back better, genuinely. I want us to look at how our economy works, the fundamentals around it, what's important to us as a region, and reassess, reimagine, and reconfigure our approaches to make that work. But building back better has to be more than saying, right, we're just going to continue the way we are. And those three challenges that I mentioned basically mean there is no return to business as usual. There is no old world that we can return to. It is comforting for ourselves to often believe that things can return to normal. And certainly I want to go out and be able to have beers with my mates without having to count the head count, see how many there are in the pub. I want us to be able to hug our families. I want us to be able to go see friends and families and not to worry about the virus. Family should still be a foundation of where we're building to. But actually, the way we travel, the way we live, the way we work, will all need to change for one or all three of those challenges that I mentioned at the start of my presentation. So I think then we need to look at what's the opportunity for where we need to be. And for me, I'm pretty positive about Plymouth anyway, and the wider Southwest. I'm a Plymouth lad. I went to university in Exeter, and it's great seeing Plymouth and Exeter building an academic bond closer and closer with every passing week. It really is positive for our region. But I want to see us have a greater ambition as a region. We don't get our fair share. And I'm trying not to be too party political in anything I say here today, but I don't think us not getting our fair share is something that is a shock to anyone who's on this webinar at the moment. Our levels of funding for everything, every area of government spending, is below the national average, with the exception of defence. Now, if we are to achieve our potential as a region, we have to address that. And we won't do that by simply saying it's not fair. We have to do that by being loud and proud about the stuff we're good at and clear and relentless about where we need to target those opportunities. And if we're looking at a green recovery, if we're looking at how we change our economy and our ways of working to be either in favor of low carbon or zero carbon technologies, then that creates this opportunity for us to really be bold about what we've got already, because we're not starting from a blank bit of paper. We're not starting on a brownfield site. The Southwest is home to some of the country's most innovative sustainable technologies, some of our most creative companies, and some of our best research, especially in relation to the marine environment. And I think what we need to do is start articulating and giving a bigger platform to that work. What you've been doing at the conference here, I think, is a great illustration of what we need to be doing, of elevating our arguments. And that means arguing for a clear destination. I'm a bit concerned that as a region, we don't really have that clear sense of direction that other regions do. Now, whether it's a northern powerhouse or a northern poorhouse, as one of my colleagues described it after the lockdown announcement this week, there's no denying that the north of England and the Midlands are beginning to aggregate together in a clearer way. Now, I want us to have that same type of clarity about where we're going. Doesn't necessarily have to accompany with political mergers, although I suspect council mergers are coming down the way, but it has to come with that sense of ambition and drive. And that means being clear about our region being the first carbon positive region, something that is a contested race. It's not for us to win inevitably, it's for us to fight to win. That means not only decarbonising all aspects of our economy, but having a greater focus on how we can provide sink resources, so how we can sequester more carbon in a commercially exploited opportunity that can build an economy and financial services products and create jobs in our communities as well. There's enormous work going on. The North Devon Biosphere, I think, is a fantastic project that does that. But equally, if you look at some of the research that's going on in Plymouth around seagrass, I think there's enormous opportunity to commercialize some of that work. Seagrass is 30 times more effective at sequestering carbon than trees. But the financial model doesn't exist for a large company to be able to say, okay, we emit X amount of tons of carbon, therefore we'll buy X amount of tons of seagrass. That's not there yet, but we're nearly there. And that, I think, provides an opportunity for us as a region, not only to be the home of that technology, but to be the home of that financial services product at the same time. And I think if we marry together our ambition of decarbonising our activities as a region, as a country, with our desire to get a better fair share, then I think we can achieve great things. And if you take a different example of that, and I know that this is a challenge for some of you, if we weren't doing this on Zoom, many of you would have travelled to the southwest. You probably would have travelled on one of our trains. Now, we've got nice new trains, which are a lot better than the crappy old trains that we used to have, but they're still diesel engines. And that's because we don't have a plan for electrification for the southwest. But the southwest could, for instance, marry together electrification, a project to electrify our train line, a project to have that additional energy carried from renewable sources generated locally, with an update of the national grid to be a smarter grid. Instead of pushing power into the southwest, is us pushing power into the rest of the country. How we can marry together a fair share investment in transport with accompanying investments in decarbonisation and a drive to have that contribute to a bigger whole as a region. Now, some of you will know, you might have heard Ed Miliband talk about his desire that we have a new environmental task force, a large number of people involved in environmental projects, partly as a response to the jobs crisis, which could see which is going to see unemployment rise considerably. Plymouth's facing, as an example, the prospect that we could hit 20% unemployment by Christmas. Now, I don't remember the last time that we were anywhere near that level of unemployment. It was in the early 80s. Now, I was playing with Transformers and Thundercats. You know, it wasn't something that I was dealing with on a policy basis. Some of you may have been around at that point, but the world has changed enormously since then. And we need to think about our interventions to address a jobs crisis in a different way than we had in the past. I keep arguing with Ed that we should be calling this initiative the Green Army, partly because I'm an Argyle supporter, but partly because I think it sounds better, about how we can translate a jobs crisis and large numbers of unemployed folk into job creation. That was done on a smaller scale when it came to innovative solar subsidies that we had in the past until they were taken away. But if we think about the opportunity for housing retrofits across our region, because actually the southwest housing quality is pretty poor. It's not as efficient as we need to be, but the retrofit opportunity could create a huge number of jobs, not only for apprenticeship level, but also throughout the entire economy. That's just on retrofitting the houses, the most inefficient buildings that we have as a region. Let alone when we started talking about replacing gas boilers with air source heat pumps, where we're thinking about true interventions in relation to decarbonising our travel. We don't have enough electric vehicle charging points. We don't have enough concentration on biogas. We certainly are not maximising the opportunities that potentially hydrogen offers. And we're just at the cusp, the exciting cusp of a development of offshore wind farms, including projects in the West Country about floating wind farms, which for those people on the call that will know the technology around it, it is quite impressive. For those folks like myself who don't come from that scientific background, it sounds almost magical. But this is the opportunity that we have as a region, and I think we need to seize it with both hands. Now, that means us being bolder and louder about how we do stuff. It means forging a new cross-party consensus about how we both project our ambition as a region, but also what our asks are as a region. Now, largely the Southwest Peninsula is quite blue. The last general election produced only 2 non-blue MPs in our region. But the cross-party work that we need is not only between Labour, the Liberal Democrats, Medwin Kerno, and the Conservatives. It means working cross-region as well, because as a region, our parliamentarians, even on the blue team, don't hold together in the same way as other regions do. And I want us as a region to form a new alliance, a new coalition between people of every political perspective in public office, nationally and locally, with business, academia, and that kind of funding infrastructure. I suspect the LEPs are not long for the world. I suspect we're going to get a new wave of devolution forced upon us. I suspect the government will shake local government quite a bit and move it round a lot. However it settles, we as a region know there's an opportunity for us to speak with a greater clarity, with one voice, as the kind of cliched phrase goes. And when it comes to building back better, when it comes to a green recovery, I'd like us to be clear about where we're looking for that investment. Because if we are to realise the opportunities in job creation and decarbonisation, let alone the opportunities for scientific discovery and research that are inevitably presented by the expertise we already have in our region, we need to be clear with government about where we want that funding to go. Now, I think there's still a case for strategic infrastructure, road and rail in particular, but also broadband infrastructure. But let's look at the natural infrastructure that we have as a region as well. Our incredible coastline, our incredible range of areas of special scientific interest on land, our wonderful moors. Now, these provide opportunities for selling ourselves in a better way. And I think there's enormous opportunity for us to slightly reorientate our approach here. As a city, Plymouth prides itself on our marine past. We've got the dockyard, we've got the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines, we've got Smeaton's Tower. And as a city, we haven't really made the most of that. In fact, I think it's fair to say we probably turned our back on the sea far too much over the last 30 to 40 years. But now is the opportunity to turn to face the sea again, not just in terms of the designation of Plymouth Sound as the country's first national marine park, trying to present marine protections in plain English, because quite frankly, we've got one of every single marine protection that exists in Plymouth Sound, but try to find a Janner who can point any one of them out is quite a challenge. Probably less so on this call, I appreciate, given the expertise that we have, but amongst the general public. But then when we marry it up with the potential growth in autonomous systems, in marine science, in terms of the decarbonisation effort, in terms of the offshore renewables that we spoke about a moment ago, then suddenly we can see ourselves orientate towards the sea again. And as a peninsula surrounded by wonderful coastal waters, we've got to do more of that. And that means just having an eye on a building back better green recovery approach, not just in the things that tend to lend themselves to an environmental perspective, but in every single aspect. So if you take fishing as an example, and I'm a bit of a fisheries nerd, so I'll be careful about how long I bang on about this. If we are to realise truly sustainable fishing, which we do need to do, both for the economic future of people involved with fishing, but also for our marine waters, we need to fish in more sustainable manners, which means we need to have a greater investment in decarbonising fishing boats, hugely inefficient diesel engines that power many of them. Plymouth just launched our first electric ferry. Having the marinisation of electric propulsion, I think, is a hugely exciting opportunity. But if you just take an element of how climate is changing and that's producing changes in fisheries, we now have bluefin tuna in our waters on large numbers for the very first time in decades. It's a really exciting proposition. Whether that's happening for the right reason due to the climate catastrophe or not, it is happening. And I want us to understand it more. So I've been working with Scott Mann, who's the Tory MP for North Cornwall, in making the case to ministers that we need to have a catch and release fishery for bluefin tuna. Not a fishery that says we'll pluck these marine beasts out of the water and eat it, as we do for other fisheries, but saying we'll tag and release them. We'll find ways of building an economic model that makes the release of those of that tuna into our waters and the study of it part of our sell. Part of the reason that people will travel to our region and spend money in our economy, simply because this is different, but because of our way of delivering it. Now, that in itself won't solve the jobs crisis, but what it will do, I think, is act as a micro signpost to coastal communities about our approach as a region. And I think we need to do this because in the next few years or so, we need to do the heavy lifting that fundamentally decarbonizes our economy. That means we need to develop better financial models for investment. That means we need to look at the cost of capital in particular, about reducing the cost of capital for investment in greener technologies. But we also need to recognize that the 6th carbon budget is going to be coming out soon. Now, bonus points if you follow the carbon budgets, because hardly anyone does. But this 6th carbon budget that will be coming out very shortly will be the first carbon budget that sets a upward limit for the amount of carbon that we can emit as a country, that will include not only the projections for shipping and aviation, which have been not included in the past, but potentially also, the roadmap to net zero by 2050, rather than only an 80% reduction by 2050. Now, I'm personally a 2030 kind of guy, but the roadmap and the carbon budget will be challenging. And I want us as a region to raise our ambition to say it is going to be difficult, it is going to be a challenge, but we've got a plan to do it. And this is how we will speak with one voice to get the money, the investment and the focus on what I think is Britain's hidden secret when it comes to our green economy, and the fact that Devon and Cornwall in particular are streaks ahead of many other places in the country, but we are miles behind telling anyone about our work. And that's why the endeavour needs not only to be one for politicians like myself, gobby ones especially like me, but also for people like you, in terms of raising our voice and our aspiration about what we need to do to build back better, because there is no return to that world that we had before, and there's no future for our country or our planet if we don't decarbonise and do things in a more sustainable way. The final thing I just want to say is I think we will need to become more accustomed to how we deliver change. Change is unsettling and uncomfortable for many people. It can be expensive, especially for those communities that don't have the agency, the money in their pocket to be able to afford to decarbonise. And it will be a challenge. But I think we have this opportunity now to really do something special, to really set an ambition that resets our region's activities, to reset our region's impression that we give the rest of the country, and to drive job creation. And let's face it, if you can now do your job from nearly anywhere in the country, why would you not want to do it from the Southwest? We should be looking at expanding our remit and our reach and our involvement. It's a great place to come on holiday. We know that. It's a great place to live. We also know that. And it needs to be said that we're a great place to do sustainable, low carbon, zero carbon business as well. And that, I think, is the opportunity. So I'm really excited to hear more about what we can do. But thank you for everything that you are doing. We're not starting from a blank bit of paper. We're starting from something that is incredibly impressive and exciting. So thank you and keep it up.
Thank you so much, Luke. There was loads of real meat in there, and I think lots of stuff that will all resonate with all of us. We've got a few minutes for questions. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes of questions. And can I just remind everyone, please, to put these in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. And the way this works is that I will read these questions out loud, which is the easy bit, and then Luke has the hard bit of answering them. So the first question we have is the Great Southwest doing anything on this green recovery agenda? Their prospectus says good things about natural capital, but I've not heard much about this since the pandemic. The aim was to be Northern House equivalent, to give a shared view. And this comes from Maria Clark. Luke.
It's a great question, Maria. I think I have a concern around the Great Southwest in the fact that it produces really good literature, but it's hard to see the delivery of it. And partly because of that, I think it's because the delivery mechanisms that stand behind the Northern Powerhouse and the Midlands Engine are so determined. They speak with one voice. red and blue team MPs, businesses, research, academia, they all come together behind a single set of asks. And I think at the moment, we don't have that. I don't expect LEPs to survive very long, if I'm honest, with the new reshaping of devolution that I think will be announced by government in the next few months or so. But the thing is, the region still exists. Our need for us to speak more clearly exists still. And so whether it is via LEPs, whether it's via an elected mayor, I hope not, but whether it's by any structure, we still need to speak with one voice. We still need to have a clarity and a prioritization of the projects that we need, be they infrastructure projects, be that economic development projects or others besides. So we do need to have all those bits together. And I think there's huge potential for it. The bit that I think is missing at the moment is a sense of common leadership, common objective, and with a region dominated by the blue team, I have to say that political leadership has to come more from them. I would love to be able to take points on this kind of thing. I'm not sure how many of my blue team colleagues would willingly swim in behind me, but actually I think there is some really exciting voices in that space. And so we do need from our political leadership to have clarity. We've got some great voices at local government, but they frequently get ignored on a national scale, which I think is wrong. I think Tudor Evans in particular, I would say this as the Labour leader of Plymouth City Council, is doing a great job speaking up for our region, but we need every single council leader to speak with that same authority and on the same page. And I think when those start aligning, that's different. The final thing I say on that, Maria, question is we need to make it politically and economically impossible for anyone not to align themselves with these messages, for people to diverge or choose to opt out or refuse to work on a cross-party basis. We need to make it unacceptable to them that is something that we as a region will tolerate. Now that's how the approach is in the Midlands and in the north of England. We need the same drive here, so we don't tolerate anything that is not moving us forwards. I think as a region, we have become too accustomed to accepting a pedestrian approach, which I don't think we should be accepting any longer.
Thank you very much, Luke. So we've got one more question I think we've got time for. This is from Matt Jackson from West Sussex County Council. And Matt asks, what can you do as Shadow Environment Secretary to influence the ear of George Eustace to work alongside Mr. Jenrick to evaluate all the great sweep work to help shape the planning system in the short term? We do need a national front, which I'm sure doesn't refer to a political party.
It's a great question, Matt. Thank you for that. I'm really concerned about the planning reforms that are being projected because of its impact on our natural environments. The ability for developers to build pretty much what they want, where they want, I think is a concern not only for me, but for many members of the public. My postbag is quite full of people that have concerns around a planning development. If we remove the local voice within that, I think there's a real risk for it. At the moment, I don't think it is Robert Jenrick in MHCLG that's really driving that. I think it's increasingly Downing Street that's driving that planning reform agenda, that kind of like removing the red tape agenda, as they would like to call it, but robbing local people of a view. But we do need to have certain standards in planning, and one of those needs to be in particular around energy use. I'm a big fan of talking about water use. As a region, we seem to have a lot of water fairly frequently, but actually most of the water that we use in our house we heat, so we have a carbon intensity for it. Most of all the water we use has been pumped, purified and treated. It's hugely carbon intensive. So we need to have better standards for water efficiency and energy efficiency and heat efficiency in our new homes. And I think that does mean that we do need to reverse some of those reforms that David Cameron introduced when he said get rid of the green crap. Well, actually, the green crap's quite useful, and we do need to embed that in where we go. And I would like to see Defra become less of a managerial department managing tick box exercises and a department with a vision around decarbonisation, nature recovery, that it forcefully makes the case for within government. I think all too often it allows itself and feels comfortable in a peripheral role, when in fact Defra should be the gobbiest department that strides across government as the environmental policeman of the government machinery. And I would like it to fulfil that potential a lot more. I don't want to wait until 2024 for that role to be achieved. I think George Eustace has the potential to do that now, but he needs our support if he wants to do it. So if you see evidence of it, let's get behind it.
Luke, thank you very much. That's great. We've run out of time, unfortunately. There were a few other questions. I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to them, but please hold on to them. If we've got any time later on, we might be able to come back to this later. So, Luke, that was tremendous. I love your view there of Defra being the gobbiest department. So let's have that as an ambition for all of us. Okay, let's move on. I've now got the slightly strange role of introducing myself. So I'm going to deliver a presentation now on the perspectives of the Wildlife Trust on the importance of the green recovery. So my name's Harry Barton, I'm Chief Executive of the Devon Wildlife Trust. And I think the first thing to say is, and Luke's just mentioned a lot about this, we are so incredibly lucky in what we have here in the Southwest, whether it's these internationally important peat bogs on Dartmoor, or whether it's our wonderful marine wildlife we have in the seas around, like this fantastic reef here. And really, there'll be few other places in the country that can hold a candle to what we have here in the Southwest. But we do know, sadly, that nature is in trouble. Don't need to repeat all this stuff. The statistics here speak for themselves. But we know, for instance, that more than half of the species here in the UK, and the Southwest, sadly, is no exception, are in decline. And some groups receive much less attention than others. So we've, in Wildlife Trust, been doing quite a lot of work recently on insects. Now, more than half of all known species are insects. And insects, we talk a lot about their roles in pollinators, particularly bees, of course, but they are absolutely crucial as recyclers, and they fulfill so many other functions, not least, of course, being a source of food for so many other species, particularly farmland birds. And yet they are declining 8 times faster than these much more familiar groups that we normally talk about. And as you can see here, the UK is in absolutely no place to be complacent. We are one of the worst in terms of the impact that we're seeing to our insect populations. Now, we're not just tackling, of course, an ecological crisis. As Luke reminded us, we're also tackling a climate crisis. Now, I haven't got time in a short talk to talk about this very much, and you all know about the facts and figures anyway. But this is just to remind us that, of course, what we are dealing with today is the impact of the emissions from 1970, because there was approximately a 50-year time lag between the emissions and the effect it has on the climate around us. So what we are doing now will be 50 years' time before we see the true impacts. And as the IMF warns us here, we are rapidly running out of time to take action on the scale we need to. And we have a third crisis, I would argue, as well. And this really underpins, I think, the other two, which is, I would call it our crisis of disconnect. So we have spent most of our evolutionary life, so Homo sapiens has been around for about 200,000 years or thereabouts, and for almost all that time we have evolved with the landscape around us, whether it's been hunter-gatherers or even in recent centuries, most of us are living an agricultural lifestyle. And it's incredibly recent in our evolutionary time that we have gone to this sort of desk-based indoor virtual environment that we're now all participating in right now. And I think this statistic always alarms me, this fact that just in one generations, so my own children will be, if they're the national average, which I hope they're not, they will be venturing 90% less than I did when I was a child. And I love this picture of this very happy child here in a park, but I always make the point that there is not one speck of dirt on this child here. So this is only one level of engagement in the natural world. We need to engage much more deeply. Now, there's all sorts of things that we need to and can do to address this, and I haven't got time to address most of them. But one of them, as Luke reminded us, is we've got to invest wisely. We are still investing in new damaging road schemes and all sorts of things that we should not be doing. We are still building poor, heat-leaky houses. We need to invest much more carefully. Now, here in Devon, we've been doing some great work on this. So the County Council has set up this Devon Climate Declaration, and we have got a coalition of people together really working hard to address that climate neutrality target by 2050, and hopefully we'll get there sooner. But we need to be seeing a proper investment in this right across the region, and the money being put into this to make sure that this all happens. But what I wanted to talk about today, really, in my short time, was the way we manage land, because a quarter of all emissions, as I'm sure many of you know, a quarter of all the emissions is related to the way we manage land, and not just nature reserves. This is the whole landscape. And this report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out a couple of years ago, was something of a game changer, because up until that point, people often seen the climate change and the biodiversity, the wildlife type argument as two rather separate arguments. And of course, they absolutely are not. Now, what this slide here is intended to show is the degree to which our landscape is similar to the condition it would have been before humans came along. So you can see the dark red areas, that's where you might get the most highly altered landscape. So no surprises, the bit of London, Birmingham, Manchester, etc. And as you go towards the blue end of the spectrum, that's where you become increasingly natural. And on the right-hand side, you see a blown up image of the southwest. And this really surprised me, quite shocked me when I first saw it, because what it shows is that actually much of the southwest region, and particularly Devon, West Dorset, and northeast Cornwall, are very, very altered landscapes. They are not nearly as natural as we would think. And actually, if you look at the landscape around us, perhaps this is no great surprise. So this is a sort of quintessential, beautiful southwest rolling pastoral landscape view. But if you look closely at it, you'll see that most of that is fields, grassy fields, perhaps 1, 2, maybe if you're lucky, 3 or 4 species in those fields. Heavily modified, heavily managed. The soil carbon is probably quite limited. And then what isn't field is generally very thin, well-cropped lines of hedges, occasionally lines of trees. There is not much space there for wildlife. There is not much space there for natural capital to perform its vital functions that we all rely on. And of course, we do have some wonderful areas for wildlife here in the southwest of England. This is one of them, one of my favourite, my local river, the River Dart, and this is about as close to a natural, unaltered river as you will get anywhere outside the Highlands of Scotland or northwest Wales. But not all of our protective landscape looks like that. This has got this bit of land here you see on Dartmoor. This has the highest level of protection of any type of land you will find in England or in the UK even. But look at that soil. Paper thin soil, very, very grazed, heavily grazed down. There's very little ability there for this area to perform its natural capital functions. And you won't be surprised to know that it falls into the category which is sadly most of Dartmoor falls in, which is a triple SI, top level of protection, not in favourable condition. So we've got an issue to deal with there. Now, I think we need to set ourselves some challenging goals here. And I would suggest that we need to set ourselves the goal of doubling our space for nature. This is going to take some time because, of course, an ancient woodland doesn't build up over 2 or 3 years, but we need to start doubling the area of space that we put at least in nature's recovery. Now, what this pie chart shows here is the current status. So the top right-hand corner, the orange bit, that's the sort of the bit between midnight and 1:30. That is current protected sites and local wildlife sites. So this is the areas that are currently, in theory, at least protected. National figures, these are 13%. In the southwest, it's about 15%, but we're fairly close to the average. Now, in the government's 25-year environment plan, it sets up some big, bold, ambitious goals. They amount to another 4%. That would take us up to 17%. But where we need to get to is 30%, which means adding another 13% on top of all that. Because most scientists agree that you need at least 30% of our land and our sea, exactly the same principle at sea, in high quality wildlife habitat if we're going to stop the current decline, let alone start turning things around. The other 70% matters too. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So what does all that mean? If we wanted to double the area of wildlife habitat, and I apologise, this is a terribly Devon-centric slide, but it's the best one I could come up with, I'm afraid. But if we meant this in Devon, it would mean putting an area about the size of an average local authority district like Mid-Devon back into high quality wildlife habitat. Wow, that's some goal. Well, of course, we wouldn't dream of trying to do that in one place. What we need is a game plan for doing so, if you like, a sort of master plan. And we're calling this a nature recovery network. I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase. Now, we haven't finished ours in Devon yet. We're a big and complex county. I know Cornwall is working hard on theirs, and they're obviously at one of these national pilots, which is great. But this is one, the West of England Ecological Partnership, which has largely done this work. And this is the kind of thing it looks like at a fairly low level of resolution. So it starts with the areas that you've got, and then it says, how can we expand them? How can we interconnect them? And where can we look for win-wins? When can we look for coastal protection against sea level rise? Where can we look at reducing flood risk? Where have we got problems of soil erosion and we might be able to deal with that? Where are the best places to grow our forests, etc.? And hence we have this great game plan which we can work to. Now, I said I'd come back to the 70%, and the 70% is crucial. So this is all the rest of the landscape, which of course is still going to be managed, and most of that 30% will be managed too. None of this means that it can't be productive and help with our economy. Absolutely can. But we've got a problem because we are using far more resources than our land can provide. So on the left, you see this big footprint, and a little bit in the middle of the heel there, that's the area of London. And what the large footprint shows is the ecological footprint of the population of London. So basically what this is telling us is that the population of London are consuming the resources that it needs in an area roughly the size of the whole United Kingdom to provide for. And there's absolutely no way that's sustainable. So we need to look very hard at the way we use our land and our seas as well. Currently, we do so very inefficiently for carbon, for water, in our use of agrochemicals and everything else. And we also need to look at the way we crop and what we crop. So I'm not meaning to be totally down on beef and lamb here, but you can see straight away the carbon intensity of this is much, much higher than it is for many other ways that we might use the land. Now, I just wanted to finish off by looking at some of the things going on at the moment in government. So at this huge time of change, very, very exciting, very concerning at the same time. And there's some great stuff out here. And here's some of the good stuff. So the Environment Bill, which is currently going through, well, not going through Parliament yet, but hopefully will this side of Christmas. And there's some, although it's only 4%, and I'd like it to be much more, it's great to have that ambition there. And that should enable projects like this, the Great Fen in East Anglia, to go ahead. So we're going to look at large-scale restoration of our natural capital and part of the Southwest. How exciting that would be. And then there are some mixed things. So the Agriculture Bill. The Agriculture Bill currently going through Parliament at the moment, doing its ping pong. There's some good stuff in here. Public money for public goods, I personally think, is extremely good, much better than just handing out money on the basis of how much land you happen to own. The strong focus on environment and environmental land management scheme, yeah, that's great, good to have that in there. And fairer rewards and simpler regulation, well, I'll believe that when it happens, but it's great to see that the ambition is there. But there's some slightly more worrying stuff as well. So there are no clear targets. Where are we trying to get to with all these new bits of legislation? Fine changing mechanisms, but where are we actually trying to get to? And what about farming advice? I work for an organisation that the biggest single part of our work is advising farmers. And my goodness, that is needed because it's a really difficult world out there for farmers, just keeping their head above water, let alone delivering all the stuff we need them to do. And how do we ensure standards are not undermined? And this is particularly worrying. You may know, many of you, that in the recent ping pong, a lot of amendments were put in by the House of Lords, just at exactly this point, promptly thrown out by the House of Commons. So this battle is not yet won. And then we have some stuff which really is quite worrying. And again, Luke alluded to this a minute ago. So this talk of root and branch change of the land use planning system. Well, the land use planning system is absolutely critical. And it's the best tool we currently have for deciding what goes where. And it's not just about what goes where, it's the standards we apply. So where do we build houses and how do we build houses? Well, on the right here, you see the Bosco Verticale. This is from Milan, one of the most innovative examples of green building I know. And sure, not every single housing development is going to look like this, but surely we can require more of our planning system and our developers just than just telling them where they can build and where they can't build. And I think particularly concerning, of course, is this, as Luke alluded to, this sense that in 2 of the 3 zones proposed, building can just proceed with very little input from anyone. One of the things we're pushing for the Wildlife Trust is this concept of the wild belt. So the Green Belt, this is where it's borrowed from. The Green Belt came out 70 years ago, Town and Country Planning Act in 1947. And this was designed to try and stop the sprawl from rapidly growing urban areas into the surrounding countryside. Well, can we be more positive about that? So the idea of the Wild Belt will be to say not what you can't do, but it's what you can and should do. Bring areas of wildlife, natural habitat and natural capital back, not just around our cities, but also within our cities too. And as crucial as any of this, I believe, is investing in health and well-being. We know there's loads of evidence out there which shows that prevention is much better and more cost-effective than cure. We know that people recover very well from mental ailments if they have access to high quality natural environment. We know it's a great environment to encourage school children to behave better and to learn. And there's no reason why we can't bring these things into our cities, into our road verges, into our streets, onto the roofs of our houses. Let's make sure we do that as part of any green recovery. And just finishing off, and I just wanted to make a point about control, because we humans are a little bit funny about control. So this is a project that we've led, and we are very pleased about, the beavers, very delighted that the government's taken a decision that they can stay. And beavers deliver all sorts of benefits. You can read them on the slide, I won't reiterate them all here. But the point I wanted to make was, again, about this control, because what beavers do and what the whole natural capital approach does is it does deliver these benefits, but it doesn't dictate exactly what you get where. And so I think we do need this cultural change where we're happy to let go a little bit of control. And that, I think, is as difficult as anything about this whole agenda for all of us. As my final slide now, on that note, I just wanted to say, I went to a place about 3 years ago. This is near Nijmegen, right where it's in the Netherlands. It's where the River Rhine estuary starts. So this is called the River Lovell, and it's this extraordinary area. Now, 25 years ago, this was all a mixture of intensive farmland and mineral extraction, this whole landscape. And then it suffered a number of years of really devastating floods. So it was agreed to find the farmers' land elsewhere, which was done, and the mineral extraction moved elsewhere too. And this area was effectively returned to nature. With a bit of help and a bit of guidance, it was a return to nature. 5,000 acres of it, or 5,000 hectares rather. Beavers have returned, wolves, would you believe it, have returned. They haven't been reintroduced, they've just found their own way there. And all this trees, all this wonderful landscape has come back. It's been an absolute boon in terms of managing the natural environment and particularly flood. And not only that, but there are now 10 times as many jobs generated through this landscape here than there were in its previous version, because it's attracted so many tourists and so much outdoor activity and so many other things. Wow, what a vision. Let's see if we can bring some of that to the Southwest as part of our green recovery. Thank you very much. Right, well, now at this point, I take off my presenter's hat and put on my chair's hat. So any questions to me, please. I will now open the question and answer and see if we've got a, yes, I've got one, great. So to Harry, looking at the picture of the child in the park, we all know of fantastic places we can drive to, but this will need to be avoided going forward. Yes, I agree. New housing frequently has nowhere natural for children to play. Being in the country, in quotes, doesn't always mean that children in particular have reasonable access to it. Will this be considered in future? That is such a great point you're making there, Naomi. And I think this is why it's really critical that when we talk about things like doubling area for wildlife habitat and increasing our natural capital and nature recovery network, we shouldn't just be talking about our national parks and our remote landscapes. It's got to be bringing the wildlife and natural capital to people. So we really need to look at, I mean, I'm looking out of my window here now, Exeter, and it's a lovely city. And it's actually green, as is Plymouth. It's a very green city, but I'm looking at loads and loads of grey roofs. I'm looking at lots and lots of concrete spaces with cars parked there. Why can we not green these spaces up? And why do we somehow think it's dangerous for our children to go out and play in these spaces? So we need to really look at how we design our cities, the spaces around our cities and our towns and villages as well. We have a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask another question. We don't have anything at the moment. So what I would suggest is we got 10 minutes or so. So there were a couple of questions. I don't know if we can dig them back up again, but there were a couple of questions asked of Luke, which we didn't get a chance for Luke to answer. So Luke, if you're still there, you still there, Luke? Yep, you're still there. Excellent. So if we can get those questions up again, then we could perhaps present one of those to Luke. I know there was one, I can remember reading one about Plymouth City Airport. So perhaps when these come up again, Luke, can you just explain to us where you stand on Plymouth City Airport? I think that was the nub of that question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Harry. I went through and tapped in an answer to the one that I didn't get to in the last one, but it was a question from Angie around where we are around the airport in Plymouth. And I mean, the Southwest has pretty poor transport connectivity. And I think if we are to realise our potential, we do need to look again at our transport connectivity. One of the bits that I think is incredibly exciting is the potential to decarbonise large chunks of aviation. But this is not coming anytime soon. So even though I want Plymouth Airport to reopen, I don't want it to open using aviation fuel. I want it to open as an electric hub. I think there's potential there, but if I'm honest, if we're ordering this on orders of priority, I would put decent public transport at the first and keeping public transport surviving, because I think there's a real risk that COVID destroys our public transport sector. I want to see all the Euro 4, Euro 5, and even Euro 6 engines in our public transport fleets replaced with hydrogen, biogas. Probably not electric, but maybe along the way. Then we need to get into our rail upgrades, and then we need to make sure that we are providing meaningful alternatives to combustion engines and diesel engines for the general public, which is, for lots of cases, producing a lot more focus on active travel. Plymouth is, as you may know, a wee bit hilly, so trying to encourage cycling without e-bikes has been quite a challenge. It's worked a little bit, but I think the e-bike revolution, I think, offers a huge amount of opportunity to reconnecting and reopening up many of the routes that previously people have chosen to use with their car. There will always be a need for probably cars in the Southwest due to our geography, but we do need to make sure that the diesel and petrol engine has a phased out date, which is meaningful. I want to see that by 2030. I think manufacturers will get to phasing out the date before the government will get to bringing it forwards. So I think the market will decide more than ministers on this one here. But then we do need to make sure we've got the infrastructure that replaces it. And as I said in my speech earlier, one thing that does concern me is that I don't want decarbonisation only to be a pursuit of affluent middle classes. It needs to be something that every single person, regardless of how much money they have in their pocket, is able to access. And I think one of the points that you raised in your remarks, Harry, on the last question was just about access to green space. The National Trust, I think, have a wonderful campaign, which I really would like government to nick, because I think Labour is certainly going to cut and paste it, around accessible green space being only a 10-minute walk from everyone in the country. And that will mean looking at land use, especially in urban areas, and look at the green space that we've got and testing whether it is truly accessible. Rather than just being green space that exists but not accessible, then I think that provides an opportunity for people to access nature wherever they live in a more meaningful way. And I think there's some exciting bits that can be done around that. But on transport, we've got to decarbonise. There's no option but doing that.
Thank you very much, Luke. Well, having said we had loads of time now, the questions have come flowing in, and sadly we run out of time. So I'm very sorry, but we'll hold on to those questions. I now know how to get hold of them if we have any space later on in the agenda. And I'm now going to move straight on and introduce our next speakers, which are Paul Edwards, Rishi Madlani, and Ian Burrow. And they're going to talk about sustainable finance and what is sustainable finance today and how it's evolving. So Paul, Rishi, and Ian.
Harry, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Edwards. I'm the regional chair of NatWest in the Southwest, and I also run the corporate and commercial team in the region. I'm joined by Rishi Madlani, our head of sustainable finance, and Ian Burrow, our head of agriculture. We're really delighted to be asked to speak at this event. Climate change, sustainability, aspects of natural capital, they're at the heart of our strategy that was outlined by our new CEO, Alison Rose, at the start of the year. And they're one of three key strands of purpose, which we're seeking to embed in everything we do. As one of the largest funders of UK business, we believe we've got a fundamental role to play in this area, not just in terms of getting our own house in order, but also in supporting and influencing our customers, and especially our business customers, make the significant changes that are needed to address the huge challenges which have been outlined by many of the other speakers. We're looking to do that in a number of ways, and we've got a real focus in partnering with experts such as Sweep, where we can use our network and reach to share some of the knowledge and best practice that exists. As a number of speakers have referenced, the scale of the challenge here is difficult to overestimate, and I think the cartoon on the next slide really brings this to life. COVID, for all its impact, is just a prelude to much greater disruption if we don't start to address climate change and the associated issues. Before I hand over to Rishi, who will talk about our approach to sustainability, and Ian, who will give some specific examples of collaboration we're undertaking in the agriculture sector, I thought it would be helpful to provide some context around the impact of COVID in the extent to which this has accelerated or decelerated the focus that businesses in the Southwest have on sustainability. I think prior to COVID, we'd seen a notable shift in the number of businesses of all sizes across all sectors who considered it a key part of their responsibility to move to a more sustainable way of operating. And there's no doubt that the last 6 to 7 months have really impacted that, as most businesses have moved towards a much more immediate focus on simply surviving. At NatWest, we've now lent over 12 billion to customers under the various government loan schemes. And whilst that's hugely important that those businesses have got the funding that they need to survive, that represents a significant reduction in the capacity that those businesses have to invest in future technologies, other transformational change. And there's no doubt some of that would have been focused on sustainability and preservation of natural capital. Additionally, we've seen a huge increase in plastic usage by a number of our customers. And perhaps most importantly of all, we've seen management bandwidth completely absorbed with repositioning businesses to survive in a much changed environment. So whilst that seems like a gloomy prognosis, I think there are some positives, especially in the Southwest. Firstly, agriculture, really key sector, has been largely unimpacted. And after a difficult start, leisure businesses have bounced back very strongly, benefiting from staycations and eat out to help out. Secondly, whilst there remains a lot of uncertainty and as highlighted, a significant increase in unemployment, most of the customers we've supported are in a much better place in September than they expected to be when we were putting loans in place for them in April and May. So there are grounds for positivity. And finally, whilst most management teams have been very stretched, there remains a real sense of resilience. We are seeing more customers start to talk about sustainability, and there is a sense of innovation and desire to build back better than existed before. So with that backdrop, I'll hand over to Rishi, who will talk about our approach to transforming our business and how we're seeking to support our customers do the same.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the Sweep team for having us here today. I'm really pleased to be supporting this. Southwest is a region that has nature at its core and a huge impact on climate change. And I've in normal times enjoyed many a visit to the Met Office in Exeter, and also supporting the financing of renewables around the region. So just by way of brief intro, out of the last 16 years I've been at the bank, which sounds a bit scary, about 12 of those have been involved in working in climate or in financing climate opportunities, and the last 4 or 5 years in strategy, in how we really drive the bank forward. Outside the office, I've just recently retired as a governor of the London School of Economics, and worked very closely with the Grantham Institute, and been working with them on place-based climate action, and on the recent report on banking a just transition, which is introducing some of the social aspects of climate. So I hope to be able to collaborate with Exeter and surrounding universities on that in the future. In my night job, I'm a local councillor, so Luke's comments about declaring climate emergency and turning words into actions is also very key to me. But in the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to give you a bit of a run through about why I think business is also critical to this, how we work better together in regions, taking a place-based approach as today with the Southwest, but how do we bring the parties together, the power of business, the power of politics, the power of academia and communities to really make a change. If we could hit the next slide, please. So why do we do it? Well, the role of business is really evolving. So before, you'd have had lots of corporations that started on the corporate social responsibility journey, either doing it from a PR, managing their risk and mitigation exercises. But this has really been a changing feast. That is no longer enough. Consumers, whether it's our customers in the bank or customers for any business, are asking for more from the companies they choose to do business with. And this tide only increases with the values of millennials and Gen Z. We see this further embedding itself in what investors are asking us about. The meetings I join, the investors in the bank, both debt and equity, that's people who buy our bonds as well as who buy our shares, are asking more and more about ESG, which is environmental, social and governance ratings. This is really driving huge business opportunities for us. And that's where we are moving into, this creating shared value. So NatWest Group, I would say right now, is trying to be a more sustainable bank, but where we're really trying to drive to is how do we create more shared value So for example, our lending to the renewable sector, where we've been the largest lender to UK renewables for the last decade, is both supporting the sector and also profitable for us as a business. But where we really want to get to is to get to a position where we can be net positive. So where we are part of the solutions, whether it's tackling climate change or other societal challenges. And I make reference to the Sustainable Development Goals there, which are unfortunately not adopted as much as I'd like in the UK, but I hope we can drive change on that. If we get to the next slide, please. So we set back in February our fantastic female CEO CFO combination, which is quite a rare, sadly still too rare a sight in the FTSE. Launched our new purpose, as Paul had alluded to. That's to champion potential, helping people, families, and businesses to thrive. Some of you may recognise this diagram. Some of it comes from the Blueprint for Better Business. So this was rethinking about how each of our key stakeholder groups influence our strategy and how they should be involved, how they should have a role in that. That's what we're doing the right thing with customers, we're doing the right thing with communities, that we're a responsible employer, which I think has never been more relevant than through COVID and through lockdowns. And then thinking about this longer term thinking, it's got being a guardian for future generations. Can I hit the next slide, please? So back in February, Alison laid out our new strategy, which focused on 3 initial areas of focus: enterprise, which is being a supporter of startups in the UK and Ireland; learning, which is being a learning organisation alongside our financial capability work; and climate. I'll just dwell briefly on enterprise and learning before I come into the meat of today, which is about climate and climate. But in enterprise, I think this is a really important piece. We've moved our 12 accelerator hubs online. We launched our first pilot environmental cohort as well, so encouraging startups to think around climate measures. But this is an important part of the business for us, and obviously as a bank, this is where we have a large impact. Paul referred to our influence in financing SMEs. Learning, this is absolutely critical. So if we really want to use the might of the power of the bank, if we get a lot of our colleagues upskilled on climate and tackling some of these issues, we really can help this. Our baseline on this comes from our award-winning schools program, Money Sense, which has helped I think over a million children, and we've actually now, which sounds very strange to say, but launched a video game called Island Savers. So if you have little cost centres running around, thoroughly recommend Island Saver, which has nearly 1.8 million downloads now, and it's very playable. But I want to focus the majority of this on climate. So if we're going to hit the next slide. So what does a leading bank in the UK and Ireland helping to address the climate challenge look like? So it's 3 main pillars for us. One is halving the climate impact of our financing activity by 2030. So this is broadly trying to be aligned with the terms of the Paris Agreement. Now, I can't stress how tough that is. We can't even currently measure the full impact of all our financing activity. So we've set ourselves a really difficult challenge. And I reach out to businesses and people out there thinking around, how do we solve these problems? How do we get businesses to measure their footprint and understand what they can do around it? We also need to, as part of our work, we've started requiring credible transition plans for any of the lending we do to oil and gas producers to ensure that they genuinely are on a transition, which I think is a really unique approach, and I think it's really important to help accelerate the transition. The middle pillar, which I think is the one that's of more interest to the audience today, but is actually about championing climate solutions and accelerating the speed of transition. So we've committed to get our mortgage book to EPC C or above by 50% of our mortgage book up to EPC C by 2030. But this doesn't even get us there with what we need to do to meet the Paris alignment targets. So there's a lot more to do around improving home energy efficiency. We need to collaborate with across industry and across academic groups like today, thinking about what the products and services that are needed. So we launched last month our Kogo pilot through our NatWest app, where our customers can track their footprint. We launched a future mobility group, which is looking at how we decarbonise transport and how we accelerate that, with the whole team focused on that. And we announced 20 billion funding and financing for climate sustainable finance between 2020 and 2022, further to 10 billion finance provided in the last 2 years. We're also looking at deep sector spotlights, of which you'll hear from my colleague Ian Burrow shortly, who will talk about what we're doing in the agriculture sector, because we as a bank have the power to both convene and to bring people together. As our CEO often says in public, we see climate change as a team sport, and we need to work with people around us to really meet these really challenging targets. The final pillar is our own footprint. So we committed to be net zero this year on our own footprint and climate positive by 2025. Amongst that, we also will try and show some leadership. So we were the first business globally alongside Landsec, one of our clients, to sign up for the Climate Group's 3 signature initiatives of Energy Productivity 100, RE 100, and EV 100, and a bit more information across those. Furthermore, we've been embedding this into our culture and decision making. This is specifically in our CEO's executive remuneration and in our targets across the business, and that will further be embedded. And I have the next slide, please. So why are we doing all this? Well, actually, we think that we as a bank have a critical part in financing business across the UK, and we think that business and working with communities has a key role to build and tackle some of the challenges of climate change. When we look at some of our assets, we have obviously a large mortgage book, we have exposure to real estate. We need to think around how do we think around what are the mitigants that we need to do? What are the things we can do to build climate resilience? And what do we need to adapt to? So this will involve us thinking in different ways. This will involve us working with the water companies, with us working with councils, local authorities, the Environment Agency, with obviously a big base in the Southwest, and thinking around what are these solutions that we need to think of as a society to minimise the cost of responding to climate change, and hopefully to get to a more just transition. I will hand over now to my colleague Ian Burrow, who's going to talk a bit more about the work we're doing with farmers and in the agriculture sector.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I'm sorry, I just lost a bit of signal there. Yeah, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much. Great to be part of this kind of conference with SWEEP. In the ag sector, we do work with lots of different organisations across the industry sector, and I see SWEEP as a very key part of that. Just to put into some kind of context, please, I don't know if you've got the next slide available. We are, as Paul said there, a very heavily reliant sector on lots of the natural capital issues you've got there in terms of water, air, biodiversity, land, soils, etc. We've got about 29% market share, so any kind of influence that we've got is quite high. I don't know, Ian Bateman's screen's on there. I don't know if my video should be working, but I'm not coming up as a screen on my own screen, so sorry about that. So we're 29% market share, and we've got about £6 billion worth of lending in our book. And just to put into some kind of context there, we've got 135 full-time managers, of which in the Southwest, 24%. So you can see there that whatever we're trying to do in the ag sector at NatWest and the Royal Bank of Scotland regarding the natural capital, the function, the services, really will have a big effect on the actual sector and the industry as a whole. So when you talk about food supply, energy supply, carbon storage, water supply, it all dovetails into very nicely into what really accounts for about 80% of my working week at the moment is on natural capital resources, sustainability and climate change in totality. So you can see there the importance and the actual key deliverable that we've got in the ag sector if we are truly going to stand behind the purpose that Alison mentioned in February last, and will no doubt mention in a lot more detail in February 2021 when we do the results. So my whole working kind of day-to-day business focus is exactly on the actual type of the conference that we're talking about. Can the farmers improve their water supply? Can they actually improve their water management on farm? What is the food supply chain ecosystem like in terms of sustainability? And are all the large supermarkets talking to their farmers and their supply chain about for example, the CO2 emissions each farm emits? The energy supply, we've done a lot of work in the ag sector 2015-16 regarding the renewables, and that is continuing to be a massive focus, as Rishi's mentioned. And we're just about to embark on a carbon storage all ag manager kind of training program to really bring home the importance of carbon sinking, sequestration, and the whole kind of tree planting issue. When you start looking into these areas, as you know, the actual where you plant the tree is just as important as tree planting. So we're doing a lot of education, awareness, and capability of all the 135 frontline ag managers on the whole kind of gambit regarding natural capital. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just give you a quick flavour of what we are trying to do. So the overriding vision that we've got is to support all of our customers transition to a low carbon economy. Paris alignment has been mentioned 1 or 2 times this morning, and by Paul and Rishi. We are the only sector in the commercial banking arena of the bank to be chosen to align ourselves to the Paris Agreement. We've done a lot of work internally with an economic department to try and map out the lending, the £6 billion worth of lending that we do against how much CO2 emissions that equates to. We're almost there with that particular difficult piece of work. And then the next stage is to map out a real good plan to try and bring that lending down in line with the Paris Agreement. One of the key planks that have come out loud and clear from the team that I run is the fact that, you know, we can't start from base camp and expect everybody to get there overnight. So we've done a lot of internal training on climate change, on sustainability, and the overall kind of awareness building to give the managers confidence to speak to their customers. And my vision, certainly in January 2021, is to be talking to all of our farming customers, again in the Southwest with a 25% market, 25% of ag managers that we've got in the Southwest, talk to all of those farmers and the rural people, the landed estates people that we come into contact with, and just discuss the transitional plan, their journey, their knowledge, in order to try and build up a picture to enable us all to work together to help not only the bank, but also customers transition to the low carbon economy that we're all aiming for. So we've done a lot of work in terms of upskilling. We've also got established a sustainable ag and land use working group from all constituent parts across the bank. And that is talking and dealing with the pipeline of products and services to support the sector. So one example would be, you know, how can we reward farmers in terms of a reduced pricing grid if their particular loan application, a reason for, is all to do with sustainability. So if a farmer came to us and said, I want to lend £2 million for a water management soil kind of project, then we should be rewarding that kind of initiative and that sustainability angle with a lower margin than we would normally see if it was for a normal kind of building, etc. So work in progress, but certainly all the products, services, propositions that support the overall natural capital sustainability topic is being worked on behind the scenes in order to deliver a market leading proposition. And some of the other kind of interesting work streams that are ongoing, we mentioned Paris alignment. We're actually at the final stages of working with a third party charity in the ag sector regarding an overall sustainability and carbon capture tool. So when you start looking at how you actually measure the CO2 emissions, for example, each farm is different and each carbon calculator more or less gives a different kind of analysis. So we're working with trying to bring to market a catch-all sustainability calculator that includes the CO2 emissions, but also takes into consideration, you know, soil, land, water, air, biodiversity, all the things that make up the natural capital kind of menu. And we're piloting that probably November, December time to see whether it does do what it says on the tin. And if it does, then we're going to roll it out in Q1 next year and try and start building up that picture, because what's in it for the farmer is the fact that if they can reduce their emissions, then their farm becomes a lot more energy efficient, a lot more profitable, so that we've got to try and explain what's in it for the farmer's point of view, as well as trying to ensure that we can lend responsibly at the same time. And we're also doing a lot of work with the large supermarkets that we've got on our contact strategy in terms of working with them to try and bring together the whole ecosystem of the supply chain, because I think in time the supermarkets will I'm not saying demand, but certainly be putting their supply chain customers under the microscope to say, what are you doing in terms of your plan? So there's lots of things going on behind the scenes. On a day-to-day basis, we're actually working to try and weave in the sustainability climate change question into our interview kind of checklist, if that's what you want to call it. So, we are treating it very seriously. We're making lots of progress. We've made lots of progress so far, but there's still a lot of journey miles to travel. But really, what I'm trying to say, I'd love to come back and update everybody on the actual journey that we've made and the kind of deliverables that were actually in place and are working. So, Harry, that's all from myself, Rishi, and Paul. Do we all go on Q&As?
Sorry, thank you very much. That was excellent, really, really fascinating. So we've got about 6 minutes for questions, and we have one question so far that's come up. So yes, if you could all please be on hand to answer questions. So the first one, the one I got, is from Bruce Howard. And Bruce asks, given the investability of low carbon engineered technology, solar, wind, etc., what are the prospects for attracting genuine private sector investment in nature-based solutions? This investment may be based on costs avoided or on stacked revenue for carbon offsets, etc.
So really happy to go first on this one, if that's helpful for the team. So I think what's clearly happening in the financial service sector is through a combination of policy, regulation, and our regulators. We've seen a lot of action move on climate and measuring carbon metrics. I think for me, and as per Paul's first slide, biodiversity and the value of nature is the next inevitable step of this. But I think at the moment, it's probably a bit more nascent than it should be on certain aspects. We can measure the value of the work that Ian's team do on linking to agriculture. But what recently we've just signed up for the working group to look at the task force on nature disclosures. There needs to be a bit better measurement around some of this, and there needs to be a bit of evolution in how we finance this. But I think you're spot on, Bruce, in that the offsets will definitely be a key to this. Some of our clients already are exploring the value of the assets they have in nature as natural offsets, and how do they drive that further. So I think the answer on this is there's a lot more work to be done. And I'm optimistic because the way we made progress on carbon, but there needs to be a lot more thinking done about this and improvement of measurement and metrics.
Yeah, I'll just add a two-minute kind of response. I take it back to the 2014-15 era when we put the renewable kind of package in place, particularly in the ag sector for the farmers. We installed a lot of turbines, solar panels, in partnership with the farmers, and when the dairy sector, for example, and Southwest to be prevalent to this, when the dairy sector went through the tough times in 2015-16 and the price dropped through the floor in terms of the milk price, the diversity income streams from those renewables served as a real kind of safety net and prop up for those farmers to enable to carry on trading in a profitable way. So we saw the real benefits of helping and supporting farmers that were initially, jumping on board the feed-in tariff and the income streams, but really the diversified income streams that came out of the reduction in the main core business income really was a lesson for everybody in terms of what can be achieved if the customer and the farmer in this instance were just to look forward and say, how can I safeguard my business, and the renewables installation, turbines, panels was a great example of that.
Thank you. Well, if that's okay, I'll just shoot on because we've got a few questions now flowing in. So we got one from Peter Young. So Peter asks, what is NatWest doing differently to bring fundamentally different sustainability projects and business models forward in the Southwest? It's very hard to get development funding to bridge the transition gap if the change is more disruptive than the examples given of supporting farmers to transition.
Yeah, I'll start on, and I'm sure Paul will come in the back of it. Thanks, Harry. One example that we're looking at, and this would apply not only to the Southwest, but to all corners of the UK. We are trying to do something different by, if you take tree planting, for example, and the carbon storage and sinking element, we are looking to bridge the actual cost, the capex of a farmer, of a rural person, planting those trees before the actual normal business income profitability break-even figure is arrived at. So we're trying to bridge the actual gap between, I think it's on average is about 7 years before the trees start to see an income stream and a profitable break-even position. So the difference that we're trying to do is saying, right, we're going to be outside the box. We're going to deliver a bridging finance that on paper might not stack up in terms of profitability and debt service cover, but we realise the long-term benefit of that particular issue.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, at heart, we can fund against cash flows that are, more or less certain. Once we have those in place, what we're absolutely aiming to do is to ensure that we prioritise those investments which will benefit natural capital and sustainability. So Rishi mentioned our pricing matrix and that we've changed. So for businesses that want to invest in areas that are going to benefit from a sustainability perspective, the wider community, then we're looking at reduced pricing in relation to those. As well as the agriculture sector, we do a lot around, we've got a couple of customers that my team look after that are rolling out electronic charge points and various other sustainability related measures. But as Rishi mentioned in the last question, the key is really is the underlying business proposition sufficient to generate cash flow to repay the debt. And there's certain sectors such as renewables where that's at the moment straightforward, and there's others where there's more work to do to create that sustainable model.
Great, thank you very much, guys. We're out of time now, but that's a fascinating discussion. Loads more questions. I wish we had more time, but that was great. I'll just leave you with a note from anonymous attendee. So anonymous attendee has said, please note that carbon storage is not all about trees. Anonymous attendee, I think we would all heartily agree with you. There's all sorts of other things we could do related to land management and habitats that are also about carbon storage and sequestration. Right, thank you all very much. We've now got a comfort break and we will come back at 22, which is in 20 minutes time, and we'll hear from Dan Hurd, Triodos Bank. Please don't be longer than 20 minutes, please, because it's really important to stick to time. You've been great at sticking to time so far. See you in 20 minutes. Thank you. Hello again, everyone. So hopefully we're all back from our break and we're all feeling fed and watered or whatever we needed. We're now moving straight on to hear Dan Hurd from Triodos Bank talk to us. And Dan's going to talk about how to develop an investable business case around a natural capital proposition. Pilot work for the government's new Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. Dan.
Thank you, Harry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dan Hurd. I'm Head of Corporate Finance at Triodos Bank. We are Europe's leading ethical bank. We've been around for about 40 years. We do lending and provide investment to projects and organisations that seek to tackle climate change and social inequality. So we're quite unusual as a bank in that we're focused on those two areas. We have been doing a fair bit of work in this emerging natural capital space over the last 18 months or so. And I think our focus really has been, and this is picking up a couple of the questions that came through in the last session actually, how do you create revenue streams from ecosystem services with a view to then bringing private capital in to fund some of these interventions? And this is the missing piece in the whole thing really. There's a lot of really good discussion and ambition around natural capital investment, and we all acknowledge the need to restore our natural environment. But how do you lever in the private capital that the government is looking for to match alongside public funding? So next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. We approached Defra, an Environment Agency, and Esme Fairbairn Foundation about a year ago and suggested that we ought to try and find 4 pilot projects around the country, all of which would be delivering different ecosystem services, perhaps in a different natural environment, and that we would work on with those projects and see if we can effectively make them investable. So this little map here, you can see where the 4 projects are, and the promoter of each project is a not-for-profit organisation. Number 1, and the example I'm going to talk through, is a river catchment project focused on natural flood management, and our client in this case is the Rivers Trust. Number 2 is a peatland restoration project in the Peak District, and we're working with Moors for the Future. Number 3, one obviously very close to Harry's heart, is the Devon Wildlife Trust, and this is creation of a salt marsh environment in West Devon with a focus on carbon sequestration and ecotourism. And the 4th one is working with the NFU in Poole Harbour. And it's a farmer-led scheme to reduce phosphate problems that we have in the harbour. So all 4 different. The aim of these pilots really is to assess the potential for developing cash flows and the potential for bringing external private investment in to fund some of these interventions. So they aren't all reliant on public subsidy to deliver this. And the plan really, these pilots, is to test, learn, replicate, and then move to scale. And a lot of these pilots really are quite consistent with current government policy. We have the 25-year environment plan, which has a very well-stated ambition of levering in large amounts of private capital into the natural capital sector. That's a great ambition. But then government has obviously put some other policy drivers in there as well. We've got the Environmental Land Management Scheme coming in 2024, as you've heard out earlier in the day, replacing the Common Agricultural Policy. So the subsidy regime for landowners and farmers is going to change markedly over the next 3 or 4 years. The government has also created a £10 million Investment Readiness Fund in the March 20 budget to assist some of these pilot projects and scale-ups to be delivered. So next slide, please, Paul. So I'll talk now about the wire catchment, the little dark blue slot there. So this is a small river catchment in the Forest of Bowland. The catchment itself, the river starts up in the higher reaches of the Forest of Bowland and arrives at the sea near Fleetwood and Blackpool. The catchment, like many catchments, is increasingly subject to flooding, and there are many communities in that catchment which carry the risk of flooding, and the 1 in 50-year flood event is now becoming a 1 in 5-year flood event. So an ideal place to start a pilot project with natural flood management as the principal ecosystem service. So working with the Rivers Trust, we have created a plan for delivery of NFM in that catchment. It's over only 70 hectares in the upper catchment, This is covering between 6 and 10 different properties. So we're talking about estates and farms. And it's a combination of creation of new wetland, grassland, and planting of trees. So really acting as a storage for floodwater, with the aim also of reducing peak flow. The intervention is really primarily based on natural flood management, but there are secondary ecosystem services that are being delivered in this project, namely carbon sequestration in the tree planting, biodiversity gain through creation of more grassland and hay meadows, and there's also some water quality improvements as a result of reducing runoff from certain agricultural use. So this is what we talk about when we talk about stacking ecosystem services. The primary service is natural flood management, and the secondary ones are the ones I've just mentioned. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Here's just some visuals of some of the interventions that are involved in natural flood management. Over 70 hectares, there are about 150 individual interventions which will be delivered on farm over a period of about 3 years. I won't go into them in detail, but they're many and varied. Most of them individually are quite technically well proven, and delivery of these will be through a combination of the farmers and landowners delivering them themselves and being paid to do so, and some of them will be delivered by the Regional Rivers Trust. So on to the next slide. The challenge in this project, of course, is how do you organise all the various stakeholders in a river catchment, and how do you create a business case out of this? So what the visual here just shows what we're thinking about, really, which is that we're going to be creating a new company to deliver this. It'll be a not-for-profit SPV, special purpose vehicle, in the catchment. And really what we're working on is a number of different negotiations with various stakeholders at any one time. So obviously we're having to talk to all those landowners and farmers because we want them to host and maintain these natural flood management interventions on their land. Now, the natural reaction of the farmers is, well, okay, at the moment I'm grazing cattle or I'm growing crops. You want me to put aside some of my land to deliver these NFM interventions. Being businessmen, they're saying, you know, how much are you going to pay me to do that? What sort of term of lease or license do you want to enter into? And what does maintenance of these things look like? So we're breaking some quite new ground here in terms of entering into leases and licenses with a range of landowners and farmers to deliver NFM. And this is all happening 3 years in advance of rolling out of Elm, of course. So there's some discussions ongoing with Defra here about how we would integrate this effectively a private arrangement with the rollout of public subsidy through Elm. We're looking to attract external private investment. This whole project is a pilot. The total capital cost of it is about 1.5 million. So what we've got here is raising money, delivering interventions, paying landowners to host NFM. And of course, the key bit is how do we create some revenues to repay all that initial investment and pay those farmers to maintain those interventions. So the sort of missing piece of all this natural capital stuff really is how do you create the revenue streams to repay all that investment. And what we've been spending most of our time doing is identifying the buyers and beneficiaries of those ecosystem services and engaging with them and seeing if they will pay for reduced flood risk. The business model in the little box on the right is just a bit of a high-level view of what we're doing. The initial investment is going to be 1.5 million. The running costs of the SPV, that's payments to landowners for leases and licenses, running costs of the SPV, maintaining the interventions, around about £50,000 a year. We've got the cost of the interest on the debt, of course. So what we need to do, the big challenge to make this little business, if you like, investable, is that we need to create £250,000 a year of revenue from those ecosystem services. So this is the big challenge. If you move on to the next slide, please, Paul. And this is the way we're thinking about doing it, and we're midway through this now. So on the left-hand side here are the ecosystem services being generated by a catchment project. The principal one is NFM. The measurement and validation of this is through some hydrological modelling, and we're aiming to sell the benefits of NFM to the direct beneficiaries listed here. And there are about 5 or 6 in this particular catchment. Names are all there, and all these parties will benefit from reduced flooding in one shape or form. So our challenge really is to engage with all those 5 beneficiaries, persuade them that they ought to be paying something for reduced flood risk, and try to convince them that they need to play their part. We're not asking them to pay for the whole £250,000 a year of revenue we need, but we are trying to convince them that if others come in alongside, they should be playing their part as well. The secondary services, carbon sequestration, water quality and habitat gain. We do have more established validation measures here, woodland carbon code, replenished being the water quality, and the Defra biodiversity credits. So these all have a value, and the objective we got is really to find who will buy those ecosystem services. So we're in discussions with corporates, both in the catchment and outside, developers in the catchment who might want to buy biodiversity credits. So really we're looking to identify all the products we've got to sell in this project and then try and find the right buyer. So if we move to the next slide, please. This is the way we're managing this project. We've obviously had a kick-off. We're in progress in terms of hydrological modelling. Most of the beneficiaries of NFM want to be involved in the modelling because they want to understand what it is they're actually paying for. They want to make sure that if they're being asked to pay, say, £50,000 a year for NFM, that the interventions are in the right place, the modelling works, and that they will see some protection of their assets in the catchment. So the water company might have a sewage works, for example. The Environment Agency might have some reservoirs. They want to be comfortable that if they're paying money into this project, there is some level of protection of those assets. So it's a very open book arrangement. It's centered around hydrological modelling. But then, of course, there's a lot of work which we in the Rivers Trust are doing to actually engage all those beneficiaries at quite senior level for something really brand new, which is a payment for ecosystem services contract over maybe between 8 and 10 years, which is the time it'll take to repay the initial investment. So we are doing something quite new and innovative here. It is quite hard work. There are multiple stakeholders involved. What we're tending to find is that there's a lot of appetite to get involved because everyone loves the thought of natural capital, like the thought of natural flood management, like the thought of working in partnership to deliver better environmental outcomes. The challenge, of course, is when you start talking about revenue contracts and approving 10-year expenditure. And, you know, this is where you start moving to different levels within an organisation and needing to sign up MOUs and contracts. But this needs to happen because obviously without those contracts and MOUs, we won't be able to raise the private investment needed to deliver this scheme. So we're making good progress. We're hoping to complete this particular pilot maybe January, February next year, and then move forward onto a larger scale catchment and use the learning on that really. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Paul. As we're working through this, as you can imagine, there are multiple challenges, but there are also some things which are working. One important thing in a catchment is using all the existing relationships in the catchment. So you have got the Environment Agency, the utility, the Rivers Trust, the local authority, local communities, all involved in a catchment partnership. So you've got a basis of relationship and trust already there to work on to build a commercial case around this. A completely open book approach is working well, both in terms of the financial model, the hydrological model, being honest and open about who the co-beneficiaries are and what part we think each player should play, so that everyone feels they're doing their fair share and that it's effectively creating a win-win for everyone, right from the farmer through to the Environment Agency, through to the utility in the catchment. And that's taking quite a lot of intermediation and negotiation, but the answer is in the middle there somewhere, where we're trying to create this elusive win-win for all parties. And entering into it in an open book way, we're finding is the best way of doing that. The EA and Defra are playing a really good role in this project, actually, and also the other 3 pilots, because they want this stuff to work. They know that to deliver the natural capital ambitions of the 25-year environment plan, we need some pilots that can prove that you can monetize ecosystem services and raise private capital. So they're playing a role as facilitators, and it may well be the Environment Agency is a co-beneficiary of NFM and may enter into a contract with the SPV in this case. So on to the next slide, please, Paul. So our ambition here, really, these are pilot projects. There are no economies of scale in doing a small 70-hectare catchment project, but the learning is immense, actually. And what we now need to do to make meaningful environmental impact is to learn from these pilots and move up into a catchment scale project, and then maybe into a regional scale. And we're talking about a river catchment here, but you could apply this to flooding within a city. You could apply it to an area of landscape you're looking to restore for biodiversity and rewilding. So all these pilots are quite valuable, actually, because they give us some tools to use when we try to scale all this up. I haven't talked much about the investors. I'm a corporate finance guy working for a bank, so investment is actually what my skill set is over the years. I'm not on the banking side, I'm on the sort of risk capital equity bond type side of the bank. And I actually think bringing the investment into these projects is probably the easiest bit. The most difficult bit is working with partners on the ground to actually create a business that is actually investable. And you can only have a business, like any other business, if you've got something to sell and you've got some revenue streams. And it's the revenue streams that is the key part of this whole natural capital sector. And this is the nut we need to crack. I think once we start seeing some revenue streams being generated and some investable business models, the investors will come to the table. But you need to have something to invest in. And that's the missing piece at the moment for us in this whole natural capital sector. So that was a quick run through of an example project. I hope that was interesting for you all. Happy to take some questions.
Dan, thank you so much for that. That was a fascinating talk. I'm afraid I'm going to have to be terribly rude and say we've run out of time and we don't have time for questions this session. However, lots of people are typing up their questions and we can all answer them online as speakers. So if you go to the Q&A section, there are plenty of good questions there. So I'm sorry about that, but we just need to zoom on, otherwise we will run out of time. But thank you very, very much, Dan. And as Dan said, we're working Devon Wildlife Trust very closely with Dan and finding Triodos to be extremely good people to be working with on this. So I'm going to move now to the next session, which is going to be led by Ben Wheeler. And this is about health inequalities and green recovery post-COVID. And at this point, I'm going to take off my chair's hat and hand it over to Ben. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks very much, Harry. So I'm Ben Wheeler from the European Centre for Environment and Human Health at the University of Exeter Medical School. And as Luke said in his introduction, those links between health and well-being and nature have been really brought to the foreground in the last 6 months or so. And the pandemic has really highlighted how important our natural environments, our parks, our countryside footpaths, beaches, gardens, everywhere in between, how important those are for our health, physical and mental health. So this session is in association with our SWEET project, Investing in Nature for Health, and I'll mention a bit more about that later. But we'll have a panel Q&A shortly, so do put your questions into the Q&A box and we'll get to those. But we're actually going to kick things off here with a talk from Professor Rich Mitchell. Rich is from the Social and Public Health Sciences Unit at the University of Glasgow, and he's the programme leader there for neighbourhoods and communities. And so Rich is going to tell us something about the work they've been doing on green space in a time of coronavirus. Over to you, Rich.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm actually a Devon boy myself, even though I live in Glasgow now, so it's nice to kind of be home, sort of. Can I have the next slide, please? I'd like to start with just a little bit of context. It's interesting, a number of people have mentioned this. I think it was Luke who began the session talking about this. During the pandemic and its kind of advent, and particularly during lockdown, there's been a really interesting shift in the way media has talked about nature and the way people have been talking about nature. And I've got a few examples here. So here's the Guardian, just a wonderful Guardian illustration here, managing to combine yoga standard lamps and green. Next, please. People like Lucy Jones, who's been writing a lot about nature recently, has been noting that there's this bit of a shift and suddenly everyone is a bit of a nature lover. Next slide. And then more recently, we've had a few people starting to reflect on this narrative and problematize it. And actually, this is a kind of context for some of the data that I want you to look at in the next few minutes or so. Next slide, please. And I love this. I just found this just now. This is the head of the Environment Agency telling us that access to nature is just too middle class. That's a wonderful quote. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of context about the work that we've been doing. So response to COVID in Scotland is organised by Public Health Scotland. It's an incredibly well organised system at the moment. And basically what they've done is to divide up the necessary responses into different groups or cells, as they're known up here. So for example, there's a cell on education, a cell on transport, and they do have a cell on what we're all interested in, which is essentially outdoor environment and space. And this includes partners from across government, from the NHS, third sector and academia. And the purpose of this group was basically to bring together evidence on how response to COVID-19 has affected environment and spaces, how people have been using nature or not, and interacting with it, to consider how this would impact on people's health and well-being, and specifically on inequalities in health, that is the gaps between generally the more and less advantaged, the health gaps, and then basically to work out what to do about this. What should we do? How should we manage these spaces? What interventions might we need? Next slide, please. So essentially what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just to present you with a bit of evidence about what actually happened to people's use of nature, rather than the media presenting what they thought had happened, and then perhaps to prompt some questions about what we should do about this. Now, just very briefly, I'm going to focus mainly on two surveys that were undertaken during lockdown. There's various technical differences between them, but that's not really important for the key messages. One we commissioned ourselves that was run through YouGov, and this took place pretty much at the peak of lockdown. So this was the time in which you weren't really allowed to go out for more than an hour a day's exercise. So kind of peak lockdown, if you like. That's a UK-wide survey. And the second one was run by Nature Scot. That came a little bit later, so restrictions had eased a little bit. Although it's a smaller survey, it was specific to Scotland only. And both of these surveys were carried out online. Next slide, please. Now, before I tell you the results, I think it's just really important to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the context. So I'm kind of assuming that most people will know this, but I just needed to check. So way before lockdown, there was already a huge inequality in who accessed nature regularly. This is a nice chart taken from Scotland's People and Nature Survey, which simply basically looks at the percentage of different groups of people who make visits to the outdoors. And if you look at the red bars, you can see that essentially poorer people and sicker people are very much less likely to do this. And ironically, for an academic who goes on and on about the health benefits of nature, basically the factor most strongly associated with not being outdoors is having poor health. There's an irony there. So that's the context. We had existing inequalities in use of nature. Next slide, please. So let's, we can skip through this one. Next slide, please. So let's have a look at what happened during lockdown, change in time spent in green and open spaces during lockdown. Now, this is an incredibly busy slide, and you won't be able to read any of the text, and that really doesn't matter. You only really need to know one thing about this slide, and that is that the orange bits of the slide are decreases in contact with nature, and the blue bits are increases in contact with nature. And what we found when we looked at all sorts of different individual groups by age, by sex, by social class, by ethnicity, a whole range of characteristics, what we found is, not surprisingly, during lockdown, overwhelmingly, time in green space fell. So it's a complete myth that everybody was out loving nature all the time. Some surveys do suggest that the frequency of visits went up in that 1 hour a day that people had. They did actually tend to go to those places. But during lockdown, time in nature fell. And for some groups, it fell really substantially. Next slide, please. Let's just unpack those results just a little bit. So this is the YouGov survey data. And this is basically looking at the likelihood of someone increasing their risk, increasing their visits to green space during lockdown. And basically the graph on the left here is dividing by social grade. So higher social grade, richer, more affluent people like us were much more likely to have increased our time in nature than lower social grade people. And if you look at the graph on the right, perhaps the strongest signal that we've got from our data is a really dramatic fall and much less likely to increase their time in nature for older people. So basically they did not increase their time in nature, they actually markedly decreased it. Next slide, please. Now, that's kind of the bad news, I guess, but one of the really interesting signals that's come through from our data, and it's rare to see something so consistent and so strong, is that for the people that did visit, when you asked them how it made them feel, they overwhelmingly reported that it really, really benefited their mental health. So on this bar, the blue bits are the interesting data, and these are the people who agree that visits to green and open space held great benefits to their mental health during lockdown. And we see that pretty consistently across ages, across social grades, and between genders. Next slide, please. Just to unpack that a little bit, there are some interesting differences. So if we say, how much do you agree with this statement that you feel that being in green spaces benefited your mental health? And we use regression analysis to try to strip out some of the potential confounding influences. What we see here are some interesting between group differences. So generally speaking, pretty much, the majority of people are saying, yes, green spaces benefited their mental health, but we see a stronger effect for that for women than for men. And we see a much stronger effect for those from higher social grades than from lower social grades. Next slide, please. So there's some interesting data in here. I've kind of cantered through it, but the key messages are there was quite a lot of polarization during lockdown in terms of who was accessing green spaces. The existing inequalities were, if anything, exacerbated. We had particular falls in use amongst older people. So what do we do with that? So what we're doing right now is making recommendations to national government, to the NHS and to local authorities, to the managers of these spaces. And these are the key messages that we might want to discuss. So first of all, it's really important to recognize that nature has not helped everybody, okay? There were marked falls in use amongst some groups, most notably older people. The second recommendation is that we need to do something about that. We're worried that that's going to persist, particularly if we go through the second wave, which we are experiencing now, and there will be a third one, and possibly a fourth one too. So we're thinking about some combination of outreach, walking groups, and community action here. Thirdly, we need to do something about the underlying socioeconomic inequality in access to, but significantly use of public and private open space. Generally in our world, we seem to focus on infrastructure with the idea that if we build it, they will come. That is not true. Not everybody will come. So we need to think about use as well as access. Fourthly, we do really need to recognize that people benefit massively from these spaces. You all know this, you all believe this. But what's about to happen is a massive fiscal squeeze as we eventually have to pay back the money that we've spent in sustaining the economy during lockdown. And what we worry about is that these spaces will be squeezed and resources will be taken from them. So we're making noises to try to prevent that. And then fifthly, we recognize that these data are quite crude and quite weak. We're building on them. We're trying to get them to be better, but we're already missing particular groups. We don't have a lot of information about people who don't respond to online surveys. We don't have children in this report, and various other groups are missing too. Next slide, please. Finally, just to say thanks to John Olson, Hannah Burnett, who's a PhD student in my team, whose work has underpinned a lot of what I've just shown you. We're from a program of research that looks at these things, and if you're interested, please check us out online. And if you want to read our report and see how this is being discussed in Scotland, there's a link there, and I'm sure we can post that in the chat as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rich. Really fascinating stuff. So I'm going to ask Becca and Kirstie to switch your cameras on, if you don't mind. We're now going to move into a kind of Q&A panel discussion for the remainder of this session. So Kirstie Pritchard is one of our project partners for our SWEEP Investing in Nature for Health project. She's the Natural Environment Officer for Partnerships at Devon County Council, and she's a key person in Natural Devon, the Devon Local Nature Partnership. And Becca Lovell is a member of our SWEEP project team. She's a lecturer in biodiversity and health policy at Exeter. So maybe I'll go to Kirstie first, if that's all right with you, and I'll just ask you for maybe a minute or two sort of reflection on the kinds of issues that Rich has introduced, nature and health, and how that's being kind of dealt with in Devon.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. So yes, I'm a Natural Environment Partnership Officer for Devon, but for quite a large proportion of my work, it's supporting the Local Nature Partnership in the Naturally Healthy agenda. So we're all about promoting the positive messages that the natural environment have on people's health and well-being, and the potential that it has to reduce inequalities, although completely take on board some of the points that Richard's just made in terms of access to green space being really important, and not just physical access, but support to people who don't traditionally access the environment to be able to do so. So, you know, providing a range of activities that appeal to the broader range of people. And so we have the Naturally Healthy Forum, which is about engaging with healthcare professionals, link workers who are involved in social prescribing, as well as a range of green providers. And we try to bring that group together to network, to share learning, and to try and understand how we can improve that situation for Devon. One of the other pieces of work that I've been asked to work on in my partnership role is also working with our partners to gather some intelligence and information around the impact on nature of COVID locally, and what the potential is for kind of the role of nature in the natural environment in terms of COVID recovery. And we're inputting into a data and intelligence group across that's led by organisations across Devon, so that we can look at COVID recovery plans as well. I think is that enough for now? Do you want me to go into kind of what we found, or?
That's great for the moment, and hopefully some of those issues will pop up in some of the questions, and we can come back to that. So just to scoot over to Becca, I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about some of the work that you've been doing, especially like Natural England and Public Health England, on these kinds of issues.
Hi Ben, and thanks for having me here. Yeah, we've been doing quite a bit of work thinking about the system level questions here, particularly about how we ensure that there's adequate infrastructure, but also the systems and processes and programs and so on, which encourage people to use green spaces, just as Rich was saying. And I think a big element of what we're doing at the moment is trying to consider how the provision of nature and how we go into funding it and investing in nature is equitable. Picking up on Rich's point about the fiscal squeeze, there's already, we know, big inequalities in the availability and usage of green spaces. And I think one of the things that we're very interested in is trying to avoid sort of baking in inequalities over the next generation through this sort of coming few years. And we're thinking about the reduction in probably funds in environmental departments, as we see previously in previous periods of austerity. What is it that we can do? What are the arguments that we can make, and what are the languages and sort of ways in which we can speak across the systems that we can use to try and make those arguments about investing in nature for health?
That's great, thanks Becca. Okay, so we've got a question here, and I'll throw this out to the three of you actually. I think maybe you've all got a perspective on it. A question here from Julian, which says, in a high density population country like the UK, is there a tension between access to the natural environment and tranquil nature rich areas? Anybody want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I can start with that, Ben. Thanks. It's a really interesting question. I suppose being from Scotland, it's a slightly different situation here, but I live in Glasgow, which is kind of nitty gritty. But actually, my perspective on this is that we have a lot of green space. We have a lot of green infrastructure. We have a lot of blue space around. There's an issue about quality. And that it's true that the kind of spaces that we have in our peripheral estates, for example, in Glasgow, are not the same as we have in our blue chip parks in the city centre and in some of the kind of posher neighbourhoods. But I really don't think that this is an issue of availability. And in fact, if you look in the survey data, the proportion of people who, when asked, who say that the reason they don't go to green or blue spaces is because there isn't a good one near to them is absolutely tiny. Certainly in the data sets in Scotland, it's almost unmeasurable. So I genuinely don't think that, I mean, I think you do have to have infrastructure that's necessary, but alone it's not sufficient. And I think the bigger issue here is an upstream determinant, which is around culture and experience. And certainly in our work with kids, for example, doing what's called the John Muir Award, which I think you have perhaps in Northern England, but perhaps not down in the Southwest, which is an outdoor education scheme for taking kids out into nature. We see huge inequalities right from the start, right from primary school, between the richer and poorer kids and who's done that kind of thing before. And then we take them, we show them this amazing world, they get really excited, the award scheme stops, and then they're stuck again because they don't have just the kind of culture, the wherewithal, the knowledge, the experience, the confidence to go and do it. So if I had money to spend on this, I would spend it on culture and education and repeated deep-seated experience throughout childhood rather than infrastructure.
Thanks, Rich. Becca, did you want to come in on that too?
I'm going to disagree with Rich here. I'm going to say I think the infrastructure question is still really important. We still haven't got the mechanisms that we need to try and ensure that houses come with adequate gardens, for instance, that streets are greened equitably across the landscape. And I think there's an argument about how we manage people within landscapes, that, you know, we have honeypot sites and they become quite degraded quite quickly. But I think the part of that is going back to what Rich was saying, is that people feel that they don't have the skills or the knowledge about how to use or visit the natural environment. They don't know how to read maps. And you get this sort of flocking of people understand there are places that they're allowed to go. And I think if we can try and start thinking about this as a system more effectively and think about providing adequate experience of nature in and around the home, so it doesn't feel like you have to go out to nature, that it is all around us. But also, you know, through our school system and the way in which we do the things that we do in life, embedding nature or the environment or the outdoors even as a place in which we can do a lot of the things that we do. So education, like Rich was saying, is a really good example. There's a lot of education that we could do in the outdoors and help children feel more comfortable, and that we see cascade through families. So as children feel comfortable in the parks, they badger their parents to go, and it has these sort of beneficial, consequential impact. So I think it's thinking as a system and not as discrete spaces or discrete activities.
Great, thanks, Becca. I don't know if you had a thought on that too, Kirstie, or should we move on?
I would agree with both. I think it's a balance of the two. It's having access and it being a kind of normal part of feeling like engaging with the environment is a normal part of your life, and that comes from what you see immediately around you. But it's also about working with, you know, young people, with schools and with, you know, across cultures to try and make people feel comfortable and confident in accessing perhaps the wider environment as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's another question here, slightly different kind of tack. A question from Jules. Do the panel have any experience of novel ways of engaging people in nature to build their confidence and skills to meet, enjoy and respect the countryside? They grew up being taught the countryside code. Do we need to refresh and update that? How and why, and be safe while you're doing it? What about waterproof trousers like the old free milk scheme? Anybody want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to comment on that one. I used to work in outdoor education, and I worked on the edge of Southampton. So we had groups of children coming from schools within kind of inner city Southampton to the outdoors, and just the kind of shock and joy on their faces when they kind of realized we were expecting them to put on waterproofs and crawl around in the mud was fantastic. I think for me it's about having a huge range of different options and support available. So it's, for some people, it's very, very small steps to encourage them to get out into the environment. You know, sometimes possibly as simple as having someone meet them at their front door to take them somewhere, because they just really don't have that engagement, whereas others are looking for more adventurous, more exciting activities. And getting people when they're young is obviously really important because they're more open to adventurous activities. There's a really interesting article in The Guardian recently around transforming old play spaces for young children into mini forests, so bringing in kind of shrubs and turf from the forest floor and encouraging them to actually play in the dirt, which actually has kind of led to demonstrable changes and improvements in their immune systems as well.
Great, thanks, Kirstie. Rich, did you want to come on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think whatever we do, we need to do it over the long term, repeatedly. So I think, you know, there's lots of evidence that kind of outdoor education schemes, you know, going camping for a week or even a weekend, things like the John Muir Award, which is like Duke of Edinburgh kind of, but not as posh as I once described it. so those things are great, but you need to keep doing it. You know, a week here or a week there of statutory provision in schools is not going to do it. And as Catherine Ward Thompson's evidence shows, you know, the strongest predictor of who goes into nature as an adult is whether you did that regularly as a child. And I think regularly is a really important word there. I guess the other thing that's really interesting that's happening a lot in schools at the minute, and I'm guessing in England, outdoor nurseries. I think it's too soon to tell whether they're going to have a long-lasting effect, but that's something that we're actively studying now. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens when the kids who've been in outdoor nurseries then go into mainstream school. But whether that's something that will sustain them or not, I don't know. But whatever we do, we need to do it often and repeatedly throughout childhood.
Great, thanks, Rich. I'm going to take us straight back to the inequalities issue here. A really interesting question from Alice, asking inequalities in terms of access and use of nature are important, but what do the panel think about the issue of those who work in nature conservation? And maybe we can think about how those things are connected. Saying we aren't a very diverse bunch. How can we support and encourage a more diverse range of people into the sector? It's a tough question. Becca.
I'll start. I started off my career working for the National Trust as a volunteer for a year. And I was lucky at the time because the government allowed you to claim job seekers allowance while you were volunteering. And it was necessary for me to do that year if I had wanted to carry on within the sort of conservation sector, to get that sort of experience under your belt, get a load of the qualifications you need to do that. But I was lucky I had a middle-class family sat behind me who could top up that job seekers allowance. I was white, so I felt comfortable. I was female, which was a bit of a, a slight issue for some of the elements of that. But, I had a lot of that cultural and social capital, which allowed me to do it. And I think things have gone downhill. I think, what I hear about now about the accessibility of these kind of careers for a lot of people, it's harder to get into because you need that social, economic, cultural capital to know how to access these jobs, to have the sort of financial backing up, to be able to spend a year, 2, 3, however many years living on the breadline effectively, to build up that experience and set of qualifications. So I think the government is beginning to recognise it's going to have a skills shortage and a sort of an issue in the pipeline of people coming through to these kind of jobs and the expertise needed. So I really think there needs to be a sort of a reflection on how we support people to get into these kind of careers. And I think there's an inequality there that's sort of already in the system, that people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds don't know about these jobs. They don't see people when they go to National Trust sites that are sort of modelling these kind of careers. But also they don't, it's more likely they have fewer economic resources to spend that period of time sort of training to become a conservation specialist. So I think we really need to think about how we support young people to come into this system now.
Great, thanks, Becca. I'm just going to wrap us up with I'm actually going to nick a bit of a question from an earlier session, which I thought was really relevant, and I think some of you might have some perspectives on. We just got a couple of minutes, but the question is, how do we identify and communicate an area's intangible assets, such as mental health and well-being, as part of the total economic value of an area's natural capital? Anybody want to take that? Kirstie.
Yeah, I think that there is already some work being done in terms of the value of interventions that utilise the natural environment to support health and well-being, on savings to the NHS. So that's certainly one thing. I think one of the examples that we had was that the Pebblebed Heaths had experienced huge numbers of visitors each year, and it's an estimated value of sort of 400,000 savings to the NHS. So there's ways of doing that already. But I also think that there's a really good question raised in the very first session that we had on the Sweep Expo. That's how do you value individual species? How do you value something that doesn't necessarily have a financial value to people? And I think that the answer there, and was really, really, really strong, was that if you feel it's valuable, then it has a value, and we have to have a voice that says, actually, there is a value beyond just the water, the ecosystem services that we get from the natural environment. That sense of well, whether it's spiritual or whether it's just, you know, that sense of value and lifting of spirits. You know, I think it's really important.
That's great. Thanks, Kirstie. That's a great way to wrap us up, I think, for this session. So so we'll finish there. Thanks very much to all three of you, and thanks for great questions from the group out there. So you can find out more about our Investing Nature for Health project at the SWEEP website. You can sign up for our new hub, which we're actually launching this week, where you'll find a range of our resources and recorded and upcoming webinars. And we've got a forum to discuss these issues with us and the project partnership. And I'll just wrap up with thanks to my colleague Sian Lovell, who's here in the background, having done all the hard work on the project. So thanks very much, and I'll hand you back to Harry.
Well, thank you very much, Ben and everyone. That's a fascinating discussion. It's got loads and loads of chat going, and I think we've all got strong views on this subject, there are elements of which are close to us, all our hearts. So really, thank you so much. That was very stimulating. Right, it's now my pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction. And this is Professor Ian Bateman, who is the mastermind behind the entire SWEEP approach. And Ian is going to provide some reflections on the whole conference. And then after that, I'll do a quick wrap up. So Ian, welcome back. Are you there, Ian?
Apologies. Just to show how expert my leadership is, I left myself on mute. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Lovely, lovely. Well, thank you for that undeserved but very warm introduction. Somebody's asking me to start my video. I don't know what that means because I haven't got a video. We wanted to provide you with some reflections from the 3 days. I just want to start with almost an emotional reflection. Just so fantastic to see everybody bringing this wonderful body of work together. It's just been a great experience for myself, and I hope for those concerned. Now, thank you. Just to remind you what the purpose of SWEEP is and its vision. On one level, and you know, of great importance to the research community, is to try and deliver impact from the research that goes on at university. But a wider issue is to actually bring the environment and its natural capital and its underpinning of the economy and social well-being more overtly into decision making. A lot of the problems that we face as a society are because we often almost treat the environment as a given, as transparent, and unfortunately it's not reflected in a lot of decisions. And even from a pure economic point of view, that means that those decisions are rather inefficient. But from a societal and environmental point of view, of course, long term, that means they're truly unsustainable. Now, in listening to the Expo, I think all of us have drawn our own conclusions about what we're doing. But let's just start off with my own views on that. So one of the themes that I thought came out loud and clear was that SWEEP was bringing better information and understanding into decision making. Here's just a few examples. So, for example, the bringing in of LiDAR data and bringing in new models, the ability to actually take information on how we're impacting on the environment and present that to decision makers in an accessible way. I loved some of the examples that were given. For example, that one that you can see up in the top left, comparing the sort of granularity of data that decision makers were faced with previously, absolutely zero, with the level of information that was now afforded to them through these collaborations. And you can see that a whole host of examples there, the ability to model what's happening on our coasts, for example, to take high resolution satellite data and find automatic ways of detecting change and bring that into decisions. It just shows research at the very cutting edge being brought into decision making. And the way in which that is being brought in is important as well. And you can see that reflected in the number of decision support tools that have been generated by SWEEP partnerships. So the upstream thinking tool, Lagasse with its fantastic array of functionality, the SUDS planning tool, and natural environment valuation online. All of these now being used for real world decision making. And of course, once you've got good data, better understanding, and tools for bringing that into decisions, you can then make better decisions. And one of the key features of a lot of the talks that we had over the last 3 days have been the ability to take resources and target them to where they will deliver the best outcomes. We saw that in numerous examples. One that I particularly liked is the work that South West Water have been doing with us on changing the way that catchments in the Southwest are managed. As you can see, there's a whole gamut of improvements to the efficiency of resource use. And efficiency, it's a dirty word to a lot of people, but actually it's really important. Resources are limited, and therefore it's very important that we use them in an efficient and high impact way. And impact, of course, is absolutely central to SWEEP, and something that we perhaps have kept under our hat is the amount of impact that is being generated by SWEEP through all of its projects, huge number of projects now, over 50 projects, across a very wide set of context, the sort of context that you get when you have a region which is so intimately connected to its natural environment. And just to point out the fact that this is not minor stuff, these are substantial levels of impact that are being delivered in partnership with SWEEP. And another observation is the level of interest in natural capital work and the demand for getting involved in it. In fact, we have a real problem in SWEEP, and that's over demand. There's huge excess demand for what we're doing. This is something that we're consistently reminding government and funders that there is a great desire to actually do better with regards to the environment. And you can see through the talks even today with Luke Pollard and Steve Lovell, this is getting through to both sides of the parliamentary debate. I wanted to very quickly whip through some information on the extent of this demand for what we're doing. This is a diagram that Martin Attrell showed on the first day, and it shows just some of the projects that are going on. It's about half of what we're doing at the moment, and how they are ranged across all aspects of environmental management, improvement, and enhancement of the economy as well. So safeguarding, natural capital, making sure that we integrate it into decision making, boosting business and policy, and mainstreaming natural capital ideas into decision making. Very quickly whip through some of those examples. So you can see here, looking at, we've seen about the coast and the 25-year plan pioneers and the national park work. Looked at, for example, the work on the pollinators. Some of the work we unfortunately just didn't have time to present to you. For example, the work on using drones, thermal imaging to detect change in the environment. Similarly, we didn't have time, unfortunately, to talk about our work on the Southwest Coastal Path, but we did get time, fortunately, to talk about the marine plan and some of the whole catchment work that we're doing. That's typical examples of what SWEEP is trying to do in trying to raise awareness of the wider impacts of change in our environment, and how, because it's a system, when you push one side of the environment, lots of other effects always manifest, and we need to bring them into the decision process. Today we've talked more about the environmental health side. Perhaps we in future conferences might be able to talk about some of our ongoing work. For example, looking at water quality and all the industries that could benefit from improving quality around the coasts. And also ongoing work now is looking at trying to integrate a lot of this information together, in particular trying to make better use of all the diverse sources of data that we have, those on the ground data, satellite data, drones, all these different sources. If we can bring them together, we actually can improve decision making. Another thing that unfortunately we couldn't talk about was the fact that we've actually got an awful lot of studentships going on, co-funded with a range of partners. Hopefully, as those progress, we'll be able to report back to everybody on progress there. So there's a number of lessons that we can see being brought out by the Expo. I want to finish with one last one. The level of collaborative partnerships which SWEEP has generated is above and beyond anything that I've been involved in before. I actually think that this could be the most fundamental contribution that SWEEP provides, that business, policymakers and communities will actually become more used to taking research and working with researchers and bringing it into their planning and decision making. And that, of course, brings us back to all those partners. And in a moment, Harry's going to make a sort of formal summing up and thanks, but I just want to give my own personal thanks to the array of partners that we have within SWEEP, but then also do the same with regard to the fantastic team that we have. I am very grateful for all the inputs that we have at so many levels across our institutions. I do hope that this will be the start of a more fundamental coming together of the universities of Plymouth, Exeter and PML. And I also wanted to thank Paul and Fiona, who have done a fantastic job right the way through, making this very seamless conference. And one last personal thank you, someone who has been behind the scenes the whole time, without which this Expo would not have happened. Absolutely sure of that, and that is Dawn Scott. who is the SWEEP Programme Manager. So I just want to give a personal thank you for participating in this event, and with that I'll hand over for the next intervention from Harry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. And what a conference it's been. There's so many people to thank. And where shall I start? I think I'll start with all the contributors, the speakers, panelists and facilitators. So around 70 people in total have been involved to make SWEEP Expo such a success. A particular thanks to our keynote speakers, Luke, as we heard today, Ian earlier on, Tony Juniper on the first day. Real reflection on the collaborative ethos of SWEEP. Big thanks to our organising team at SWEEP, the University of Exeter, especially Dawn, as Ian's just said, Sam, Steph, and Helen, who've worked tirelessly to put everything together. And of course, you too, Ian, muted or unmuted, video or no video, you've been a star. Thank you. None of this would have happened, of course, without supporting funders and organisations. So that's the Natural Environment Research Council, University of Exeter, University of Plymouth, Plymouth Marine even Laboratory, and the amazing technical support we've had from Paul and Fee from Mindfully Wired, as we just heard. And really just a personal reflection on this. What is so inspiring, I think, is that we have so much brain power and so much enthusiasm behind this movement that we're trying to push. And now is really the time to make that push, I think. We're starting to hear noises, more positive noises in central government, nowhere near where it needs to be yet, but we're talking in much more positive terms than the sort of language we were hearing a few years ago with the green crap and all this kind of thing that we used to have. So that's a big move forward, but we need to keep pushing. We need to push everyone, all the decision makers, all the politicians, and all of us keep doing this amazing work so that we can really show that the Southwest is the place of excellence when it comes to natural capital. And we should really get everyone to believe that, frankly, if you don't think natural capital in the Southwest is where it's at, then you're an idiot. And no one wants to be an idiot. So on that very positive note, thank you all very much and goodbye. Oh, and before we go, I should just say, I've been asked to say there is still a workshop, the conference is closing, but there is still a workshop happening on developing business cases to support investment in nature from 4 to 5 today. So if it's full, I'm afraid, but if you've registered, please stay on. Thank you so much. Goodbye.